And welcome to the RENA and IMREST Southern Joint Branch technical lecture on fuel and technical challenges to decarbonisation. Before I introduce you to our speaker tonight, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So the lecture tonight is being recorded and afterwards will be uploaded to YouTube if anyone wants to go back and revisit it. We will also be doing a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. And the way we do the Q&A will be dependent on how willing you are to be recorded. So if you're happy to be recorded and to appear in our video, you can just raise your hand, which is if you hover at the bottom of the controls, you get a raise hand option. And then at the end, I will allow you to speak and you can ask your question and any follow-up questions that you like. If you don't want to be recorded, then type your question into the Q&A chat, which is also can be found if you hover at the bottom, and I'll read your question out so that our speaker can answer it. So our speaker tonight is Carlo Raucci, who is a Marine and Decarbonization consultant at Lloyd's Register's Maritime Decarbonization Hub. He has more than 14 years experience in research in the shipping and climate change fields, as well as advocacy on energy systems transition and low carbon transport. He also has delivered several projects advising governments, international organisations, shipping companies and port authorities on decarbonisation strategy, as well as authoring several publications on the topic of transition to zero emissions vessels. So without further ado, I would like to invite our speaker to share his screen and the lecture can start. So Carlo.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and we will get started with the lecture. So. Okay, so can you confirm you can see it?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you very much for having me today. My name is Carlo Raucci and I work at LR in the decarbonization and new established decarbonization hub. I have joined the hub since the beginning of this year, and but I had the pleasure to work with LR since 2012 when LR funded my PhD, looking at the potential of using hydrogen in shipping. So if you have been looking at the issue of decarbonization in shipping in 2012, you may remember that there were not a lot of people talking about hydrogen or any low carbon fuels at that time. So when I look back, I'm always very grateful to LR to actually have been funding my PhD and believe in this idea already 10 years ago. But that's enough about myself. Now let's get started with the lecture. So there we go. So in this lecture, I will briefly introduce the Marine Decarbonization Hub. I will get the opportunity, since this is a quite new things in LR, so I will get the opportunity to introduce a little bit more the hub and as well as our getting to zero model. But then I will focus on the scale of the challenges of the decarbonization and actually the main drivers and how these challenges is very strongly connect with the fuels. And I will then focus on what the ideal fuel for the decarbonization should look like. And we will see the characteristic of an ideal fuel. And then we will zoom looking at the challenges and opportunity of the most likely fuels for shipping. So we look at the option of hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, and methane. Finally, we will wrap up with some conclusion, but let me anticipate some things. We are not going to say which of this fuel is better than another. This is not the purpose of this lecture. Rather, we are going to focus on assessing the fuels, so providing a simple framework for assessing the fuels in a consistent way, so that next time that you're going to listen to a presentation about a single fuel, you will have an understanding of how this fuel compared with other options. You may be familiar with this expression if you have been following this debate, that there is no silver bullet, sorry. And actually, that's the point. We are not trying to say which fuels is better, but actually only highlighting some insight about challenges and opportunities. So the Lloyd's Registered Maritime Decarbonization Hub has a clear mission. We want to accelerate the sustainable decarbonization of the maritime sector to deliver safe, technically feasible, and commercially viable zero-emission shipping by 2030. And we want to do this, and we set some objectives. So we will identify and enable a sustainable transition. We wanted to put in place a safety standard that will enable a safe transition. We also aim to build partnership with first mover to innovate and to demonstrate the route to scale. We want to build capacity for safe design and operation of zero-emission vessels. And finally, we also want to provide right tools to enable decision-making. In order to do so, we have established our own approach, which you can see in this diagram here, which is composed of 3 elements in order to identify in order to assess the marine solution readiness level. And the component, we aim to do this by assessing the technology readiness, the investment readiness, and the community readiness. We actually have translated this approach in actually a tool. We call this our Getting to Zero model. The overall readiness, as you can see, we can put this diagram in a slightly different way to highlight the fact that the overall readiness of a solution is actually a combination of technology, community, and investment readiness. We aim to track the readiness of different technology in order to assess the readiness of a solution. So this model essentially can identify the bottlenecks of a marine decarbonization solution. And we use this tool in the hub in order to focus our activities to progress the overall readiness of a solution. So just to give a practical example, if we have a fuel, for example, that is technology mature, and there is a good business case, but actually a lack of safety standard for marine application, well, we are going to put our effort in establishing safety standard in order to progress the overall readiness of such fuel. So this is us, this is how we operate. Now let's talk about the decarbonization and understanding the full decarbonization of the shipping industry. As I said, this is a very strongly connected to the question why we need new fuels. But let's start with this graph that you can see here, which shows essentially potential decarbonization trajectory, and with full decarbonization by 2050 or by 2070. And in this representation, we also have highlighted the IMO ambition, which essentially is the most important ambition of the IMO initial strategies, which says that, which aim to reduce the annual GHG emission by at least 50% by 2050 compared to 2008. So this is the challenges, but let me talk about the drivers behind these challenges, because one thing that often is not discussed, it doesn't get enough attention, is that one of the main drivers for the shipping emissions are 2 drivers: transport demand and carbon intensity. Transport demand sometimes doesn't get enough attention, as I was saying, and I will give you some example of why transport demand is actually very important. So saying that, let's say that the fuel has claims to reduce the emission of 10–20% compared to the fuel oil, the current fuel oil. That's great, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we can reduce of 10–20% the overall emission of the shipping industry. Transport demand could increase 2% every year. This means that in the next 20 years, we could increase transport demand of 40%. That means that we need many more ships. So if we have a fuel that reduces 10–20%, but we also have we also need many more ships to meet the transport demand, we could end up actually to still increase the overall shipping emissions. So it's very important to take into account the transport demand. And then another example could be the opposite, right? On the other end, we could have a transport demand that is actually stable or even decreasing. And in that case, let's say that the challenges is easier, it's more achievable, and fuels that may have some constraint on their availability or supply can actually play a more important role, because you need less ship to meet the transport demand. However, the prediction are that transport demand will still increase, and that actually there are still uncertainty of potential mode shift. For example, transport demand could be moved from sea to land or vice versa. So from land to sea. This means an increasing of transport demand. That's the transport demand, and then there is the carbon intensity. When we talk about carbon intensity, we are talking about any technical and operational intervention that reduce the emissions from shipping. So we are talking about reducing speed, optimizing voyages, use of energy efficiency technology, as well as obviously changing fuels. So it turns out that many analysts, including myself, have produced a number of scenarios where they also change the transport demand and different other uncertain parameters. And one thing that I think everybody can agree is that we need the contribution of low carbon fuels. And that's the key point of why we need low carbon fuels. So this is the two main drivers, but this is not the whole equation. We need add another element in our equation, which is how we're talking about here only operational emissions from ships, or do we need to account also for emissions that occur for the supply of this fuel, so upstream emission. The graph here only shows operational emission, and the IMO moment ambition refers only to operational emissions. But the debate is there, and there is a discussion to consider if actually the objective should include the whole life cycle, the well-to-tank emissions. So what I've called here the emission from shipping energy demand, including operational and upstream. Finally, and this is just for setting the scene of such challenges. The IMO regulations have got the ambitions, but also we have other type of goals like the Paris Agreement or 1.5 degree. So the expected pace and timing of new regulations to meet such goals will be determining the response of the whole supply chain. And I'm finishing with the whole supply chain, and I want also to introduce next slide, where I want to clarify what we mean by supply chain and why it's important to look at the challenges of a full decarbonization when in perspective of the wider energy system. So we said that it's important to have a contribution of the low carbon shipping in fuel, but where these low carbon shipping fuel are going to come from. So we need to start actually from the feedstock, the resource to produce these fuels. So it's coming from biomass, from electricity, from renewable energy such as solar, wind, or fossil fuel with carbon capture. Then obviously this feedstock will be used in conversion, in production plant, any conversion system. And also in this stage of the supply chain is also very important to consider other sectors that could actually compete for the same fuels. So the integration of the production with the demand of other sectors. Once the fuel is produced, will need to be distributed to bunkering hub. And so therefore, the bunkering and the rule of ports. And then the fuel will be stored on board, will be handled on board, and this has to be done in a safe way with crew that will be trained for that. And then finally, the fuel is used in propulsion, main machinery, and but also auxiliary machinery in different type of propulsion systems. And this is to describe, to clarify what we mean by supply chain, the whole supply chain. Okay, we have identified the challenges. We know that we need low carbon fuels. We know that the low carbon fuels need to be looked at along the supply chain. So now let's have a look at what might be the ideal fuel that will resolve the decarbonization of the shipping industry. So as you can see, I'm using same structure of our tool. And I'm using this simplified template just to for this lecture, just to make the things a bit more interesting. But this is not meant to be completed. So the ideal fuel will have some. Ideally, we want to have a fuel that is a technology. In terms of technology, is mature. But also, we want to have a fuel that comes from sustainable energy sources. It should be produced for sustainable energy sources that are actually that have a potential to be scaled without compromise the sustainable use of the sources. As I said, the technology should be mature and scalable. The storage tank, essentially, together with the characteristic of the energy density, the potential solution of the design, it should guarantee that we don't want any loss of cargo capacity. Ideally, the retrofitting of this fuel, so let's say that we have a current ship and we want to retrofit with our new ideal fuel, should be easy. And also we want to have a fuel that is safe and to use, to handle with minimal new skill and training. And if there are some risk or implication in case of accident, obviously we want to be limited as much as possible. This is to give some technical characteristic of the ideal fuel. If we move on the investment instead, we also want a fuel that is competitive in terms of CapEx, OpEx. So essentially what we're talking about here is the cost of production of these fuels. We want this fuel to be scalable in terms of infrastructure with costs that are competitive. Also, the capex of onboard technology should be affordable, and the overall, the price, the final price we want, that has got low volatility, because it could be demanded from other markets. So we want a fuel that has got low volatility. Low cost of retrofitting, so it has to be easy to retrofit, but also with low cost. And overall, we want also a fuel that the business case, let's say, of the fuel is robust enough. over time. So the TCO, which is the total cost of ownership of a fuel of the ship, should be, which include the capex, opex, and also the voyage costs, should be robust over time against the other competitors. Finally, our ideal fuel will need to have characteristics that meet the acceptance of the community. If there is a disaster, we want to have the society has to accept some risk associated with this fuel. Obviously, we want a fuel that, as I was mentioning before, has got low or zero well-to-wake emissions. We want a fuel that meets all sustainability criteria, that doesn't have any impact on the air or water, and potentially that create new employment opportunity, or at least it should create more jobs than eliminating jobs. So this is our framework, and I'm going to use this framework to assess the fuels that we will go and talk in a moment. But before going there, I just wanted to highlight the fact that despite the title of this lecture, this is not only in technical issues. This is actually an issue that also involves the investment, also involves the community. There is a need to have a different business model. It's very likely that the shipping industry will not have access to a single fuel only for this industry, but there will be a fuel that will be demanded also from other sectors. So the whole procurement system of this fuel will have to change, have a different business model. The investment is also, as mentioned, very important parameters. Today, investing, it means also investing in adaptability, and this has to be based on the expected policy. So the point that I was making earlier, so the timing and the pace of the investing of the regulation, but also the level of stringency of the regulation will essentially set the relative competitiveness of fuel amongst the others. And finally, is also an issue that as we see, it relates to all supply chain. So it's not shipping owners, shipping company, but also port, but also fuel suppliers, also shipyards, a bunkering company. So it's more an organizational challenges here, if you want me to allow me to use these terms, so there is a need of synchronize all these stakeholders. Okay, so we have now the framework of our ideal fuel. I'm now moving on assessing and zooming in on the challenges and opportunity of each fuel. And I will start with hydrogen. And so to start with hydrogen, I wanted to focus on the fact that we are talking about here transitions. So transition based on hydrogen. And whenever we talk about transition, we need to take into account the fact that we have a time dimension. So we have decision to be taken today, in 1 year, in 5 years' time, and so on. So this slide here is actually an attempt to emphasize the fact that the hydrogen solution has to be put in the context of a transition towards hydrogen. So today, obviously, you cannot really operate in a hydrogen ship. so you cannot really use that. So the decision of today is actually using fuel oil, or you can blend it with some biofuel or LNG. And then there will be an era in some years where there will be diversification and a hybridization. So in the case of hydrogen, we may see a dual fuel with blue hydrogen, but also some ships that perhaps goes on 100% of biofuel, or some blending with LNG. And after this year of diversification and hybridization, where it's likely to have a bespoke fuel supply developing, we are going to enter after that an era where there is a takeoff of the fuel, so rollout of hydrogen. So in this transition, we envisage the use of first of all blue hydrogen, and then a mix of blue and green hydrogen, and so therefore, and then in long term, green hydrogen. You may be wondering what are these lines at the bottom of the table. Well, this is just an attempt for me to say that whatever decision you take today, these ships are going to be running, operating for the next 20 or more years. So the decision to take today and in the next 5 or 10 years will actually have an implication along let's say in the long terms. So that's an illustrative example. We don't want to say that these are the only potential transition based on hydrogen. There might be other, but this could be the most likely one for hydrogen. I mentioned about blue and green hydrogen, but I have not defined that. So now let's zoom a little bit more about hydrogen and its production method, the fuel characteristic, and obviously the key challenges and opportunity for marine application. So production method, how we can produce hydrogen. You can Google this, and very quickly you will realize that there are many type of diagram showing up how you can produce hydrogen. You will quickly realize that actually you can produce hydrogen in many different ways. I have selected this one from the Royal Society, which I think is very nice because highlights, the results where it come from, the energy conversion, and also the potential application. As you can see, you can produce hydrogen. I don't know if you can see actually you can produce hydrogen from renewable energy through biological routes or electrolytic routes, and I call this green hydrogen. And then you can also produce hydrogen with fossil fuel, with CCS, which I call this blue hydrogen. So as you can see here, hydrogen can be used in different sectors, not only shipping or transport, which is also a key element in terms of wider energy transition. Let's have a look now at the fuel characteristics. So if you see on this side, so one of the key elements to assess and fuel is looking at the gravimetric and volumetric energy density. So hydrogen has a very high gravimetric energy, which means energy for kilogram of fuels, but it scores very low in terms of volumetric energy density. And this is a key problem, let's say, around hydrogen, because in terms of energy per volume is very, very low, even if you're talking about liquid hydrogen, which is stored in relatively complex tank that needs to be cooled down quite significantly. What it means that having a low volumetric energy density, well, it means that if you want to store the same amount of energy that at moment would be on, for example, on a marine diesel, the tank of the fuel will have to be more than 4 times bigger than the current MGO tank. So a lot of space requirement in case you want maintain the same energy density on board ships. Apart from the energy density characteristics and the storage characteristics, also we have some safety around hydrogen because it's flammable and have invisible and high temperature flame, and also could be explosive. So this is also element characteristic of the fuel that needs to be taken into account. So when it comes to the main challenges and opportunity for marine application, well, today storage remains one of the main issue around hydrogen, and because it's costly, and because of the space requirement we touched early, there is a likely loss of cargo capacity. And this is onboard ships. When we talk about the distribution of hydrogen, becomes also quite challenging because of the storage requirement. Safety on board and at port could be a problem, could be need more attention because of this characteristic, as mentioned, about flammability and explosion, risk of explosion. But on the other hand, hydrogen could actually reach very high efficiency when used with fuel cells, although fuel cells are not yet mature for marine application. Another, let's say, opportunity using hydrogen is that is probably the only fuel that can guarantee a very low or even zero emission from a GHG perspective, but also from any other air pollutants emissions. And finally, because it can be used, and it's very versatile, so it can be used in different applications for other sectors. There is a potential for synergy and learning from other applications. So this is hydrogen. So now I want to use the framework of our ideal fuel to see how hydrogen can be compared with our ideal fuel. So what we can say is, in terms of technology readiness, if it's green hydrogen, actually it could, it use sustainable energy sources. Obviously, there are some elements in the production of hydrogen that are not very mature, but the technology are there and are known, and this is not a lab stage. But when it comes to the investment readiness, well, there is a lot of question to answer because, as I said, there is quite high cost related to the storage of fuels, and the business case of hydrogen on board ships is not quite robust. But in terms of community readiness, actually, as we said, has got great potential in terms of emissions, GHG, air pollutant, and many countries are actually looking at this option. So there's quite a lot of interest and acceptability of the community, and I would say that there is a reason to be quite optimistic around that. Although hydrogen safety is something that remains to be a bit explored a little bit further. Just check how I'm doing with time. Okay. Let's move now on ammonia. I would use the same structure for each fuel. You can see now we are talking about a transition based on ammonia. It's very similar to hydrogen. You have some option here that actually don't have a lot to do with ammonia, because you can really operate ammonia today. But in the era of diversification and hybridization, actually, you can start to see some case of dual fuel, or the case of actually that's of using ammonia in an LNG ships. This is also depending if you are building an LNG ready for ammonia, which has also some implication in terms of cost, obviously, but it's a route that is possible, and that eventually this transition will brings you to an takeoff era where you will likely use blue ammonia, and then a mix between blue and green ammonia and green ammonia, which is very similar to the transition that we have seen for hydrogen. So ammonia, let's zoom a bit more, and let me start with that. There is no ammonia without hydrogen. So ammonia, the key element of the ammonia is actually hydrogen. I'm using again another diagram from Royal Society. And but as we have seen now, we have only one way here represented to produce hydrogen, but actually we know from before that there are many ways to produce hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. Hydrogen is combined with nitrogen that is obtained from the separation of air, and then is using the Haber-Bosch process in order to produce ammonia. Ammonia is today used as fertilizer mainly, but has got also other potential use that is not only for transport actually, but has got also some other potential application. In regards to its characteristics, so we can see that ammonia here has a low gravimetric energy density compared to hydrogen, but also diesel, and there's also a low volumetric energy density. So it scores a little bit low, but the fact that as you can see, relative to hydrogen, the fact that the volumetric density is a bit better than hydrogen, it means that essentially instead to need a tank that is 4 times bigger than a marine diesel, you actually need a tank that is roughly between 2.8, 3.4 times bigger than MGO. Another obviously key characteristic of ammonia is that is basically a toxic fuel, and this is and one of the main concern around ammonia is toxic for humans and for aquatic life. So moving on the key challenges and opportunity for marine application, actually the safety appears to be one of the major concern. There are potential severe consequences both on board ships and at port. But having said that, there is also there is a lot of effort actually is going right now on this, and there are projects now that are establishing rules and standards to safely handle ammonia on board, despite its characteristics. Another element of concern around ammonia is the NOx emission and the type of pilot fuel used in an internal combustion engine. But this seems also to be something that is manageable to resolve, although the much more clarity needs to be explored regarding this concern. There is obviously experience in the industry of carrying ammonia as cargo, and so this is also an opportunity to learn from this experience. As I said, the storage of the tank requires less space, and one important thing about ammonia is that compared to other low carbon fuel, it has a competitive cost of production, which is obviously an important parameters. So let's see how ammonia score against our ideal fuel. So in terms of technology readiness, well, that's very similar to hydrogen because can use sustainable source, scalable technology. If you use renewable energy, it should be okay, it really depends on the sources that you're using. Storage tank in combination with energy density and new design, actually, there are some concern obviously on losing cargo. So it's not that you're not losing any cargo, but it's better than hydrogen. In terms of investment readiness, as I mentioned, there are reason to be optimistic around the overall business case, but a lot of questions because how far this can be against other competitor is something that need more exploration. And finally, in terms of the communities, perhaps it's called a little bit less because of concern of on air and water pollution, and obviously, as we said, in terms of is it safety use on board ships. So the acceptance of these fuels, it really relies on the fact that more evidence needs to be produced in order to say that this fuel can be safely used in marine application. Okay, I think I will need to go a little bit faster. So this is the case of transition based on methanol. It's a little bit different from ammonia and hydrogen. As you can see, you actually have some option to use methanol right now, blending with biomethanol, or even use 100% biomethanol. In the first year here, we have some blending of bio and blue methanol potentially happening here, or dual fuel, and then a mix of bio and blue methanol, and then take off of blue and green methanol in the long terms. That's quite interesting because this sounds to be a bit more flexibility in the short term of using this type of fuel. But one thing that I want to highlight is that there are types of methanol, and I like this diagram from Irina, where you can actually finally see the green and blue. But also one thing that's really nice is that you can actually see the the brown and the gray methanol, and this is and reason of concern, because if you are using methanol today, you really don't want to use this type of methanol because it could actually emit more emission that actually emits than fuel oil. If we look at the fuel characteristics, is actually very similar to ammonia. It's got a little bit better volumetric energy density, which means that in terms of space requirement, you will need some things. I think I took note of this. You will need some things around. Let me see if I can find quickly. About 2 or 2.5 times bigger than MGO, which is slightly better than ammonia. Also, its toxicity seems to be more manageable relative to ammonia. So the main challenges, the opportunity, obviously there is a regulatory framework for methanol that is already being established. The fuel is competitive, but there is a lot of uncertainties around the cost of production in the long terms. So let's say that the methanol future proof is heavily dependent on the supply of renewable CO2, and so therefore technologies such as direct air capture. And on the other end is methanol could support an efficient transitions, because you can go from bio, blue, and green. Although, as I said, we should discourage the use of brown, gray on non-sustainable biomethanol. Let's have a look quickly, the comparison against the fuel, the ideal fuel. Well, technology seems to, it's not too bad. The technology is there. The investment, as I said, a lot of question, because it's especially around the long-term, mid-long-term competitiveness of this fuel, and acceptance also, we say that is actually not, it could actually be not bad. Readiness. Very quickly on the methane instead, other transition based on methanol and methane. So we're talking about gas. So you can start with LNG. You can then move on LNG with and blending with bio-LNG, and then moving in the long term with a mix of bio-LNG and synthetic LNG. This is the production of gas. I choose this time a diagram from CDELF where you can clearly see the production of the bio-LNG and of the synthetic LNG. And once again, we have our good friends hydrogen here, which can be used, which we know can be produced in many different ways. One of the things to highlight that once you have produced methane, you actually also need to liquefy. So these add extra cost. In terms of characteristic of the fuel, well, you can see that it scores a little bit better than methanol and ammonia in terms of gravimetric and volumetric energy density. This means that actually we will have some things about 1.7 times bigger tank relative to MGO. But you know, there is some complexity around how we storage LNG, but is something that now has become quite, we have got a lot of experience in actually storing LNG on board ships now. And this is one of the key opportunities for these fuels, which also have a very strong training program already in place. But if we look at the challenges, the main challenges for this fuel is actually its significant risk in the mid long term, because there is a potential concern around the capacity, scalability of bioenergy, and the risk of locking in long-term option today. The cost of producing synthetic LNG can actually be quite, is not competitive relative to other zero carbon fuels. Is expected to not be very competitive. And most also quite important in terms of challenges, there are still some GHG emission associated with that. You will still emit some CO2 at the beginning of your transition, and methane slip is actually some concern that needs to be resolved. So in terms of scoring against our ideal fuel, well, technology-wise, is and technology that is mature, investment, a lot of questions to answer here about the long-term capacity to be competitive, and community, I would say, there is some concern about the sustainability and the emissions that in terms of CO2 and methane slip. That's my highlighting of the challenges and opportunities for each of these fuels, looking at the transition and the whole supply chain. All of these transitions are not meant to be complete, exhaustive. So there could be other transition in there. So there could be a transition based only on biofuels, although we know that there are some concern around the potential scalability of the of this fuel, but also other options like nuclear, SSC on board, which I have not mentioned in this lecture, but just to mention that these are other options that could actually play a role. And finally, I'm gonna leave with 3 points as conclusion. As I said, I'm not gonna say anything around which of this fuel is better than other, but one thing that I guess we have learned that there isn't an ideal fuel. But multiple possible transitions are actually possible. When we look at the transition, this means that the fuel will change in terms of carbon intensity and price. But nevertheless, we are confident that there are possible compatible transition to achieve our goal. Another point is that there is we know that there are different challenges and opportunity with all fuels by now, but we do need to have a mid-long-term perspective in order to assess each fuel. And finally, given the risk of that we are exposed, investing in flexibility today could be a good point, but with a robust decarbonization strategy for tomorrow. That's my three conclusion section. I'm gonna stop here. Sorry, I probably didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but happy to answer now any question.
Okay, thank you, Carlo, for a very interesting lecture. Whilst everybody's thinking of their questions, we have one already, which has been on the Q&A, so I'll read it out. And that is, do you believe that small craft fuel selection will be determined by what is available rather than what is best suited to its application?
What is available today, I guess?
I'm not sure because they put it in the Q&A. Maybe answer both today and then also potentially in the future.
Yeah, the availability of fuel is a key point. And you know, when it comes to availability, we also, as one of the conclusions, we need to look at what is available today and what is likely to be available in the future. As I said, there is a need to look at this from a transition point of view. So if you are selecting a fuel that is available today, to have to make sure that that fuel has some benefit of using. We don't want using a fuel that actually could emit more than what we currently are emitting. And so therefore, the decision, I think, will be driven by the fact that you will need to have a flexible transition that allows you to change from whatever fuel you decide to choose to select today to a fuel that will decrease their impact in terms of GHG emissions.
Okay, don't appear to have any other questions. Oh wait, no, someone might have posted another one. Ah, yes. Based on your research, do you consider the IMO target to be achievable?
Yes, I think there is a reason to be optimistic on this, and obviously, you know, the challenges, as I was mentioning, is a complex challenge, and there's different drivers. So it really depends also from parameter that we could do some projection like a transport demand, but we still have some uncertainty in there. But overall, I think that the IMO goals are achievable, and a lot will depend from the level of stringency of new regulation that will be put in place. Because, you know, I have explained and highlighted the challenges of zero carbon fuels, but in the end of the day, these zero carbon fuels will need to compete with the conventional fuels. So the future GHG regulation will need to make sure that this gap between zero carbon fuel and conventional fuel will have to be bridged.
Okay, our next question is 90% of trade is done on ships, but shipping only contributes 2.7% of the carbon emissions, and land transport contributes to 30% of the carbon emissions. So why the panic about decarbonisation?
Yeah, I think this is a question that I used to get this question many years ago, actually. And one of the simple answers is that we need to put this in the perspective of the wider energy system. The whole energy system will decarbonize, and the 3% that today's shippings account, if shippings will not do anything and will continue with the BAU, will increase to 10, 15%. These are, you know, there are some research around. I have actually personally done some research around these potential scenarios where the whole energy system decarbonize and the shipping industry will not decarbonize. In this case, having an industry responsible for 15% of the global CO2 emissions, I think is quite a concern for any stakeholders operating in the industry.
And I suppose it's a similar argument that, for example, people in Australia make. They say, oh, Australia only contributes sort of 0.5% to global emissions. But when you add up all the countries that contribute 0.5%, it's 40%, and all they have is half their emissions, and we've halved global emissions by 20%. So I suppose.
Yeah, there is also there is a very interesting plot where you actually can position the shipping industry in the country, amongst the countries, and you can see that I can't remember the exact position, but shipping could emit like a country that are positioned as the third or the fourth as a contributor of the global CO2 emissions. So it's significant.
Okay, so the next one is not actually a question, it's just a thank you from Glyn Jones for a very clear explanation of the future challenges. So, yeah, thank you. Moving on, we have a question is, have you thought about the suitability of using nuclear as a way of addressing this?
Yeah, this was mentioned in one of the last slides. So obviously, I have a focus on the transition that we think are the most plausible one, but there are other that are under investigation, and perhaps they need a little bit more investigation. Which amongst these is actually the nuclear option. Nuclear obviously has interesting potential, I think, for shipping, and in LR we are actually doing quite a lot of work around these options. But we also have to say that nuclear, when we assess the option, the readiness of this option amongst the technology investment, the community readiness, we know that the acceptance of around this technology has still some clear obstacle, let's say, barriers. This doesn't mean that that the nuclear is not an option, but just that more evidence needs to be provided that its application in marine is actually suitable.
Okay, next question is, which country or countries have the best infrastructure for handling 3 or more fuels?
That's a very interesting question, and this is not, I would say this is not about having the infrastructure today. I think we need to look at this from the perspective of energy sources. And I will say, I will slightly change the question and say, which one of the country has the potential to produce this fuel based on their energy sources? And so you can, I would say that one of the main drivers will be countries that have access to large amount of renewable energy. I always say a country that has the potential to have surplus of renewable electricity, when I'm thinking now about producing green hydrogen, but also country that, for example, a combination of country that could have a good availability of, for example, of natural gas and storage capacity for carbon, so CCS storage location. So this could be another route for producing blue hydrogen, for example. So any country essentially that have got potential to have a surplus of renewable energy, and at the same time is perhaps also located close by, in proximity of key bunkering hub. That's the country that I would be focusing. I'm not mentioning any, but I hope I have given an idea of the regions. So I will, if we want to mention about region, I can mention, there is the whole South Asia area, or the North Africa, or North Sea, but also in South America. I'm basically mentioning all the world, but yeah.
Okay, next question is, which method do you think will be most effective at encouraging investment, a fuel surcharge or a carbon tax?
That's a good question, and I would say that there are different mechanisms of incentivize the use of zero carbon fuels, and that are actually under debate and discussion, and there could be some, let's say, details that need to be explored. Let's say if we are applying a carbon tax, how we are using the revenue of this carbon tax. This also, can generate some interesting discussion that is actually already generating interesting discussion. My opinion is that wherever measure we are talking here has to be as much as possible technology agnostic, but most importantly, we need to make sure that we are closing the gap with the conventional fuel. So it's more, to me, it's more about finding the right level of stringency.
Okay, so then our next question is, another limiting factor that could drive someone to opt for an alternative fuel is the storage on board and the impact on stability. What do you think about this?
Yeah, the storage on board, I've touched on this in the presentation, is quite important. Stability is some things also that is important, but in terms of storage, one of the key concern, we have seen from this little graph on the gravimetric and volumetric energy density, any fuels that we are considering has some different characteristics from what we use today. So it's very likely that we need to come up with a different solution, which it means from new design, from storing less energy, so changing your operational profile by refueling more often, and storing less energy on board. So all of these will then need somehow resolve the storage issue on board. For some fuels, we can be more optimistic. For others, we, I guess, need to take in consideration to have more impact. But having said that, I want also to emphasize the fact that, I have highlighted a lot about the characteristic of the fuels and how they compare to each other. But one other element is also the ship. So we have many different types of ship, type and size that operate in different markets. And so, the ship itself becomes a criteria for the ideal fuel. So just to say in other words that, the storage solution could be different. It could be a different solution based on the type and size of ships.
Okay then, and well, our last question isn't really a question, it's another thank you for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
So I guess if that concludes the questions, then thank you again for a very interesting lecture. As I said before, this lecture has been recorded. It will be posted on YouTube in the next few days. You should all receive a link when the announcement for the next lecture goes out. The next lecture will be on the 8th of April and will be on Southern Ocean Science and the RSS Sir David Attenborough capabilities. We've got someone from the British Antarctic Survey giving us a talk on how they plan to use the Sir David Attenborough. So that should prove to be very interesting. So as I said, just look out for our emails. You can also follow us on Eventbrite, and you can get notifications when we publish new Eventbrite events. You can also join our LinkedIn group if you look for Southern Joint Branch Marine and Arrest, and we announce things there. And obviously, once you find the link to our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and you'll get notifications directly from that with the videos being uploaded. So thank you all for your attention, and hopefully you'll all attend next time, and good night.
Thank you very much.